The victory of a separate homeland was a sweet yet painful one. Millions of refugees flocked to the fledgling state. Homeless, sick, separated from their families, children orphaned or abducted, women widowed, raped.
After partition, there was a great need for focusing on rehabilitation. There was massive movement of people, migration, people coming in totally bereft, without their belongings, losing their families, and there was a need to address those situations. That's where women got mobilized.
The most prominent of these were Fatma Jinnah and Rana Liaquat Ali Khan.
It was women's voluntary service, which came to address the issue of rehabilitation of all those people who had been dislocated, displaced.
उन्होंने पाकिस्तान बनने में जब औरतें आई हैं उनके लिए बहुत कुछ किया है। बच्चे जो इतने पढ़े हुए हैं वे यारों मददगार आके लोग ले गए। उन्होंने कहा कि नहीं हिस्सा नहीं है, ये जायदाद के मालिक बना के दिया जाएगा बच्चा। कल ये नौकर बना के ना सारी उम्र बच्चे को रखे, पता नहीं किस किस खानदान के बच्चे हैं।
All along, Fatma Jinnah was one figure that was publicly visible. Her efforts in promoting women's education, especially nursing, other professions. She was one public figure that was visible all along those years when we find there's a gap in politics. She, as a social icon of improvement for women, was there.
A little while later, in '49, you had the Prime Minister's wife, Begum Rana Liaquat Ali, setting up the All Pakistan Women's Association, APWA, which of course continues today.
This Pakistan Women's Voluntary Service converted itself into All Pakistan Women's Association. The objective at the time was to address the issues of so many new entrants into the country, their schooling, girls and women's, their health.
APWA went on to become the largest social body active countrywide for women's education, economic independence, healthcare and childcare today. Though several progressive women's organizations formed post-independence, the struggle for equal rights was constantly thwarted by religious conservative opposition. Some went as far as calling the Prime Minister's wife and the ladies of APWA prostitutes for walking the streets unveiled.
The Naval Guard, the reserves, and the women were being taught self-defense, and suddenly you get all of these Maulvis who had of course opposed the creation of Pakistan but were now in Pakistan, protesting that this was completely un-Islamic, unacceptable, etc. And so the naval and guards and reserves were cancelled. And I think that was the first indication of how over history we've seen how women's rights are always sacrificed for some kind of political compromise. There were other groups. There was the Democratic Women's Association that was started by Tara Mazhar Ali in 1948. They had a greater focus, not so much on parliament, but on working class women and the oppression that they faced.
The Democratic Women's Association was a women's section of the Communist Party. But then when the Communist Party was banned, the Women's Association continued. They struggled for women workers' rights very much. The women's right to work, women's right to write as political beings, as workers. And they worked with the underprivileged groups, the labor, women from the labor classes, the poor. It was more politicized than APWA was, for instance. APWA was charity-oriented. Democratic Women's Association was more political.
Women now focused on getting social and political rights made part of the new state's legislature.
We should remember that women had been mobilized to participate in the struggle. There was a lot of people who felt that now that we've achieved what we were mobilizing for, the women don't need to now come out and they can now go home and be comfortable and their needs will be addressed. But these women said that, you know, we want to be part of the political process. We want a space within the system.
When Pakistan is sort of debating what Pakistan will be about after partition, we suddenly say, well, what are we going to be? What type of a society we're going to be? One of the key questions, almost as important as whether everybody will get the vote and whether it will be a federation or whether it will be an Islamic republic, was what will be the status of women in this country. And a women's committee was formed in 1953 called the Women's Rights Committee. In other words, women's rights was always on the agenda. And in fact, it was APWA and it was women who demanded that Women's Rights Committee. That Women's Rights Committee was meant to look at law and meant to look at the rights of women for including in the first constitution. So it was always a constitutional issue.
In the face of staunch opposition from religious clerics, two very determined members of the First Constituent Assembly, Jahanara Shahnawaz and Shaista Ikramullah, managed to force the Prime Minister to pass the Personal Law of Sharia Act 1948, giving women for the first time the right to inherit property, including agricultural land.
Within the assemblies, there were only two women, but they were they really struggled for women's rights. They produced a women's rights charter within the assemblies. So their role in the Constituent Assembly was to make sure that women's rights are safeguarded in the new constitution. And they were the pioneers.
According to Shahnawaz, for instance, she expresses herself in her autobiography. She said something like, as long as we can ensure that there are women in Parliament and making decisions, then we've done our job, and the next generation needs to take over to ensure.
Where the women felt that they were getting marginalized, they could marshal women outside to put pressure. So that was a very interesting, we see happening, the occurrence of women in the assembly and women outside having a compact of taking the women's struggle forward.